Well, it seems like those are the key years of history in Lowell, right? That's their they put the showboat. If you Google Lowell, that's the picture that the image that shows up on Google is the showboat. They're historical. If you go get the history of Lowell or the tour of Lowell, you get the showboat. There's still banners of the showboat. It's still a very central part of that community, right? And I would add to some of what Matthew said, and really contextualize more what I said. There hasn't been resistance to people I know, but everything has come from the outside, right? Pearl Bailey refused to come unless the minstrels ended, so they ended the minstrels. And the showboat's name, Robert E. Lee name, was taken off of it just recently in the last 4 years, I believe, simply because of outside pressure from state funding, right? They didn't think state funding, that my money, your money shouldn't be going to support a boat named the Robert E. Lee. Remember the showboat had actors, Louis Armstrong, all the way back to the very first. As McKinney Cotton Pickers were very popular, and they're an African-American band, were very popular at the showboat. It's not like Jim Crow, where you didn't have white people and black people on the same stage, and it was just a different form of entertainment than you would get in the South.
The last performance that still was going to feature was planned to feature blackface was going to be in minstrels, was in 1977, and that had really sort of come at the end of the restart. Right, it had been gone in 1967, is brought back in the early 1970s, a very conscious choice, and in really ways to push back against the thought that there wasn't any sort of opportunity to sort of close the show down or to do that sort of a better work. And so to that end, what really comes down to that is that it really reflected that perhaps no longer a community. Lowell had started to change by the 1970s with the construction of the Interstate 96. You now had an easier movement back and forth between Lansing and Detroit area to Grand Rapids. Suburbanization had really taken off, so therefore you had new housing developments. If you look at a map of Lowell, maps of Lowell at that time, you can tell how quickly it was starting to grow. You also begin to have more new families coming in who are not necessarily tied. And another interesting piece that sort of jumped out at us was the number of people who had been involved with the showboat for decades, not just like new people. You had organization that had really become sort of very static. So what you end up with is members who wanted to still do things the same way and were not really keen on having folks change things up. There were no changes in performances. Like you still had Pearl Bailey, a wonderful performer, but that appealed to a particular demographic in the community, one that certainly was not going to be popular with their Led Zeppelin listening children and grandchildren. That certainly wasn't going to fly. And that rock and roll had been explicitly sort of pushed to the margin. If it ever showed up, it was definitely a marginal, like, oh, here we did this for the kids. And that's an important thing, is that the showboat didn't change with the times. It didn't sort of evolve. And one of the pieces is that by the time you get to 1977, it took an outside performer to say, no, we're not going to do that. And what I think frustrated showboat organizers was that she had performed earlier with that and had been viewed much like Louis Armstrong, who had also performed for many years on that sort of style, that sort of black-faced performers, began to say, no, we're not going to do that. It is no longer acceptable, and did so on a level of principle. And I think that threw off the organizers, that if someone who had been there before, had been an excellent draw, had been willing to perform, was going to say no, maybe it's time for it to be done. And they had a choice. They could either have no national headliner, or they could have no showboat. And they opted at that point to bend and to have the end men, the blackface minstrels, become sort of Kentucky colonels. You sort of dressed up in a silly costume and you do your thing, but without blackface. And that really brought it down. And what does that say? It really does say in many ways that for many communities, it's if you have sort of an established sense of authority and leadership that leadership can really carry on and have an impact on communities that we don't really think about. And and even if they do bring new members in, oftentimes those members are going to be vetted to sort of support that. I mean, some of the folks who were even younger on the board were also not going to really challenge that. And in small communities and many communities, who wants to be the person who rocks the boat, who really stands out? I think most of us would do anything to avoid a fight and that sort of contentiousness. And it really wasn't that sort of moment at that time, especially in the years that followed the civil rights movement of the 1960s and early 1970s. And so you end up with sort of a change, really be a change agent being an external force, much as in the present day. You needed the circumstances, you needed that push, you needed where the boat in the present day was just in such bad shape, you had to do it, and you have a breaking point. And this too is a breaking point to where there were increasing questions as attendance, as revenue declined, as things had really not gone well in the 70s. It gave it the impetus with Pearl Bailey's refusal to perform on stage with black-faced performers to really break that. But it wasn't really an organic choice by the group that put on the Showboat. And in many ways, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that change is an external force. And that partly is why I think some community members clung to it and sort of have that identification. It was like, we didn't want to get rid of it. Those people did. You get a very particular us and them kind of component, which goes to the second part of the question. How does that shape the lack of coverage of this, of opposition? I like to think of it too as also, in one part is, whom do you take seriously, right? You have an outsider in the Grand Rapids press. That's the big city. This is still a rural community, and they're not going to take too kindly to the big city folk telling the community you should give that up. In addition, Grand Rapids' African American community, though it had grown significantly, still remained a smaller part of the overall regional population. And that sort of dynamic has an impact of muting those voices. And even when the press took it seriously, you have the sense within communities, as the historian Todd Robinson at UNLV points out, that at times you don't really push because the sense is that if that's what they want to do, that's what these folks are going to do. And us showing up there is not necessarily going to get them to stop it. And that there was a sense that there were other fish to fry, to borrow metaphor. Even the city's African-American newspaper more or less said almost nothing. And really sort of, when it did mention it, was like, if that's what people want to do, that's what they're going to do, which is sort of an unhappy sense. I found that to be terribly troubling, that there was a sense that we would just be ignored anyway, and it will make our lives worse. To where even in the community, you have people that would write to the Lowell Ledger and its various incarnations. It changed names a number of times. And the sense is that it was also the problem of what I like to think of as Michigan nice, that, we tend to eschew, confrontation in many ways, and that this was something that was going to really make you stand out in that regard. And there was a tension between longtime residents and the newcomers, whom owns the community, who has say in that community. Is it a place that's home? And even for the press, not just because they're overtly racist. In fact, there is coverage. Their columnists, white columnists, begin to go, what is this thing? What a dinosaur. But it has the impact of still being that us and them sort of sense.